Welcome to We Have Ways 12 Days of Christmas Guests. We're talking to a famous face about their personal relationship with the Second World War. While you recover from Christmas dinner-related food comas, tuck into this brilliant and wide-ranging chat with none other than James May. Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, and we're very fortunate to have snagged this next guest in particular. Who are we talking to today, Jim?
Well, he's one of the best-known people on television in Britain and around the world, I should probably say. Motoring journalist, star of Top Gear and now the Grand Tour, and a zillion other TV documentaries beside. It's none other than James May, who's also weirdly, well, not weirdly, but coincidentally, I should say, an almost neighbour.
And me. So we're strangely...
Double neighbours.
Strangely triangulated. It's decided to live in proximity of both of us somehow.
But anyway, it's very nice to have you on, James, and thank you for joining us.
No, thank you. You were very generous with your introduction there. I don't know what episode you're thinking this is going to be. It could be on the spike, as we used to say in newspapers and magazines. But...
Well, I do remember watching in one of your programs. You were beetling around in a maybe you were in a people's wagon. I'm not sure, people's car, but you were certainly in Prora,
yes,
up on the Baltic coast. That really weird Nazi hotel.
Yes, it was actually. I was in Dr. Robert Lie's personal Beetle, which was a bit creepy, to be honest.
Oh
because
my God!
I didn't want anybody to think I was in any way aligned with his foreign or domestic policies or anything like that.
No.
But as a piece of history, obviously it was a very early Beetle, actually made by Porsche in Stuttgart, because it would have been built before the KDF factory in Wolfsburg was complete.
Yeah.
So an incredibly valuable, history-laden and slightly disturbing artifact. But the correct way to arrive at Prora, obviously, if you didn't go on a KDF cruise ship, I suppose. And I think since we went, which is best part of 10 years ago now, they've done quite a bit of restoration work on it. But when I was there, it was still largely the ruin that it had always been, to be honest, because let's be honest, it never functioned properly. But they completed a few family rooms using artifacts of the time, right down to the KDF board game and the KDF radio and the KDF bog roll and the KDF sheets and all the rest of it. And it was, absolutely fascinating. A colossal place in a, to be honest, slightly unlikely spot when you compare it with, I don't know, the Costa del Sol. You can see why Spain triumphed in holidays.
Yes, I've been there in winter, and in February. I've been filming there in winter, and this wind comes in.
Not at its best.
I know. The wind comes in off the Baltic, and you sort of think, because sections of that were sort of nudist beaches and stuff. And you have this Strand Corp. They
were really into what do you call it? Sort of going nude, weren't they?
Yes. Fascists always are. They've always got a bit of a strange relationship with nudity.
Yeah.
It goes back to the Romans.
Well, actually, I'm sure you're right about that. But also Mussolini had these holiday homes as well, and I went to one up in somewhere in the South Tyrol, and it was incredibly remote. I mean, you were sort of climbing up, doing all these hairpins up and up and up and up and up and eventually you sort of went, and then you crossed over this bridge, and it was a waterfall, and kind of kept going, and then the kind of road sort of ran out. And then you were on sort of, cobbled, kind of, on a stone. It wasn't a Strada Bianca. It was just a stone track, which hikers go up. And then suddenly there was this clearing. And it's this freaking huge, great, multi-story kind of, the sort of thing you would find on the Costa del Sol.
Yes.
But in the mountains and made under the kind of, under the instructions of Mussolini. And it was just completely bizarre and abandoned. And it was just the weirdest thing. I mean, it made no sense on any scale whatsoever.
No, I mean, I've never been there. And you have to think about what was happening in, say, Britain at the time, because I think we'd only just prior to World War II, we had the Holidays Act, didn't we? Which is what gave birth to Butlins and the like.
Yes.
And there is I don't know if this is substantiated, but there's a rumor that a lot of the Nazis' holiday camps and indeed concentration camps were to some extent modelled on Butlins, or was it the other way around? I can't remember. So I suppose holidays were grim in the 30s, but even so, I think it might be a fundamental failing of the fascist movement that they didn't quite get what a holiday was about. They seem to have regarded it as something that was supposed to improve you or set you free, and they didn't realise that what you actually wanted was some fairly reliable weather and double egg and chips, which is, what made the first package tours for the British so popular. Not going to the Baltic coast.
And doing calisthenics in a cold breeze, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then a lot of the sort of fascist thrust was sort of to be outdoorsy and all that sort of stuff.
You get your rucksack on and go hiking and
cycling
and do sort of vaulting over people bending over and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of that, wasn't there?
Yeah, it's nudity, bunting, community singing, exercise, walking and cycling. Because apparently some of those, again in the 30s, well, it might have even gone back as far as the late 20s. But cycle touring became very popular with young Germans, and they liked particularly to cycle in France and England. And supposedly they were actually very elaborately disguised spying missions. All these people in medium-length shorts riding around, undoubtedly in formation on bicycles, making
in a
notes.
Swarm. Exactly, in a swarm.
Yes, exactly.
Going down the old Blandford Road. Exactly.
James, to go back to Robert Ly's VW would have been one of the only few made before the war, because the thing was basically a Ponzi scheme, wasn't it?
Oh, utterly, yes. I mean, it was the great rip-off of the, I think, largely innocent German working people, because it was funded by the Green Shield stamps equivalent savings scheme, and the money went into building the KDF factory, what is now the Wolfsburg VW factory, which was then used to make things like V1s and bombs and tin helmets. And I don't think any of the general public who contributed to the scheme ever got a car.
No, I don't think they did they? The Nazi brass would get one, but if you were a punter who'd been contributing all this time, you didn't, did you? Because after all, they wanted the money for weapons and everything else Nazi, basically.
It's why that factory was so heavily bombed, mainly by the Americans. I mean, they weren't trying to rid the world of the Beetle. Admirable objective though that would have been.
Are you not a fan then?
No, not really. I've often said that the VW Beetle is in many ways the worst car ever produced. But in terms of car history, it is actually the most interesting car the world has ever produced by quite a long way, because, I mean, it started it starts with probably a bit of theft from people like Hans Ledwinka in Czechoslovakia and various other German designers, some of whom were Jewish and therefore repressed. And then Porsche came up with the sort of greatest hits of small car design ideas, of which there were a lot in that period. Yeah. And then Hitler got involved and said it had to look like a Beetle, because he was obsessed with natural history and thought streamlining should be inspired by nature. And then it turned into a con trick. Then it was rejected as a war reparation by Henry Ford, Lord Rootes, the Australians, lots of other people who thought that the Beetle was a hopeless car and the factory was too close to the new Iron Curtain. Yeah. And then it became the world's best-selling car, and then it became an icon of the hippie movement and was turned into the beach buggy. So Hitler's idea...
Yes, and then Herbie Goes Bananas.
So it sort of starts with fascism and ends up with flower power and surf Nazis. So it's Nazis to Nazis. It's
very
really
weird, isn't it? I mean,
it is. It's a tremendous story.
Well, then in the middle of it, the British Army reviving the factory and getting the whole thing going post-war as well. So Ivan Hurst coming in and getting it back up on its feet.
Well, the weird thing is, I've never been able to entirely substantiate this, but the rumour is that when Hurst got to the factory, he only found the remains of one Beetle in the wreckage. It had been very heavily bombed, but he found the remains of one, and he found enough drawings and bits of tooling and surviving Germans, including King Nordorf, who was the key to all this, to get the thing back into production. And of course, he was only really making it to provide basic transport, the sort of car equivalent of the Honda Super Cub, to the occupying forces. So he was going to make a few thousand, and then they said, well, you better make 20,000. And then they ended up giving the whole restored lot back to the Germans, effectively as a nationalised industry, and then it became the world's best-selling car. So we're the mugs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and who says the British can't make successful cars? I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? So British perfectly capable of making cars successfully, but in Germany, there's multiple ironies colliding there, aren't there?
But what is it you don't like about the Beetle? I mean, I feel completely agnostic about it, if I'm brutally honest. But is it the engine in the back? Is it the fact that it's just tinny? Is it the fact that it just constantly breaks down? I mean, what?
They don't really break down. They don't. Incredibly reliable, and the design was intended to be adaptable, which is why it became the Schwimmwagen and the Kubelwagen. They're all Beetle-based cars. Air cooling was very good, especially in places like the desert. Very reliable, very easy to service. The problem for me is it comes with a great deal of sociological baggage, all the way from "Do you secretly like Hitler?" to "Are you a surfer?" All of these things are. It makes a terrible noise.
They are loud, aren't they?
Yeah, they're loud. I must admit, I've got a beach buggy on the quiet, and it is based. All beach buggies are based on a shortened VW Beetle platform and suspension, and the underpinnings of mine are very old. I mean, most of it's new, but the basic engine case, the floor pan and the suspension members are from about 1955. So it's a very early, nationalised, if you like, VW. And it is still technically, as far as the registration document is concerned, a Beetle. There you are. I've said it. I've come out.
Revealing secrets on Weird Ways of Making You Talk. We've made you talk.
Yeah.
I'm very excited. So if you, I mean, from a car point of view, I mean, in Nazi Germany, there were some pretty A1 cars coming out.
Yeah, there was...
do you have a personal soft spot, or does the sociology that comes with it just sort of black mark the whole lot of them?
No, it's just the Beetle. To be honest, I think it. I mean, I'm not much of a classic car buff, or I don't really like old cars because I just think modern cars are better. But German engineering in that period was fabulous, all the way from clock making, toy making, armaments, cars, aeroplanes, which I'm sure we'll come on to. That's all great, and I own German cars and motorcycles. I think the biggest problem with the Beetle is not actually its fascist heritage. It's the sort of people who own Beetles now, because they talk about them in sort of hushed tones, and they say, well, of course, mine is the 1602, very rare, whatever. And I think few things in life are less rare than a VW Beetle. I mean, individual baked beans maybe, or wire coat hangers, but people think they've got something incredibly special. And I want to say, no, it is the world's best-selling single-platform car by some margin. So,
I mean, it's more than 15 million, isn't it?
I think, including the Mexican production and all the rest of it, it's about 21.
I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah. It's a lot of cars, and they're all pretty much the same. Toyota say the Corolla is a bigger selling car. It's a bigger selling name, but it's been on, I can't remember, 6-7 generations of car that are all quite fundamentally different. Whereas all of the Beetles, the window shape changed and the lights grew, and a few bits of kit like, I don't know, a radio or a heater were added. But it is basically the car that Porsche designed in the 1930s, and it's remarkable. Really remarkable, especially as it's terrible.
Very funny.
I mean, you touched on the idea that German engineering, I mean, aircraft engineering is the thing that really, where people look at the competition between the Allies and the British, and there are some proper red herrings, and then other things that are undeniably brilliant. And I remember years and years ago, we got on the subject of Kurt Tank and the FW190, which you seem to be a fan of. I mean, are there aircraft from this era that and designers where you think this guy's the fella making the running, or what he's doing is really interesting?
Well, everyone should have the Kurt Tank story in their library.
Yeah, I think Kurt Tank is a very interesting, quite radical thinker. But I think Willy Messerschmitt, he did make some mistakes, undoubtedly, but also did some fabulous things. German aero engine technology was amazing, and in many ways miles ahead. I mean, the reason fuel injection on cars was pushed hardest by people like Bosch, who are still world leaders, is because I think so much work was done on it in the late 20s and throughout the 1930s. But I think World War II aeroplanes of which I am particularly fond are the Hawker Hurricane. I like the Hurricane, the Spitfire, the 109 and the 190. Those are obvious ones. I have a soft spot for the Bf 110, despite the many criticisms of it. I love the Curtiss P40, and I really love the Mitsubishi A6M0. That's another really fascinating aeroplane because the Japanese thought about what they wanted it to be able to achieve and effectively seemed to have looked at the size of the landmass they would have to conquer and patrol with it, and then made sacrifices in some areas to improve it in others. So we know famously it had no self-sealing tanks, it didn't have any armour, it was notoriously fragile, but it was very fast, fabulously manoeuvrable, gave the pilot great visibility and had an
incredible range. Yeah,
incredible range that led to real confusion amongst the Americans because they couldn't believe. I mean, they started trying to work out where Japanese air bases were that weren't there. It's simply that the Zero could fly twice as far as their fighters.
Well, and the other thing is the pilots at the start, from by 1937, the pilots are just exceptional. You're not even getting near a Zero until you've got 500 hours in your logbook.
No,
whereas, a Luftwaffe pilot in the Battle of Britain, maybe have 150, 170 maybe, but not more than that when they're first arriving at their squadron. So 500 lot, and, the discipline required, it's absolutely brutal training.
Yes.
And so they're absolutely superb. So it doesn't matter that they're not well armoured and they're very fragile because the pilots are just so much better than anybody else they're going to come up with. So they can, they're not getting shot down. But then inevitably there's attrition. And then, it's all out war and they can't sustain that level of training. And then you've got a plane that's fragile with not very good pilots, and of course that's a catastrophe.
Yes, and especially once you've got things like the F6F Hellcat, which is fabulously well armed and very fast. I mean, the Wildcat had a pretty tough time against the Zero, and as you say, it didn't really matter that the Zero wasn't well armored because nobody ever got in a position to shoot at it, really. But once things like the Hellcat were on the scene, the Zero got a bit of a mauling. It's another of those aeroplanes that was never significantly updated.
That's it. It sort of flatlines, doesn't it? And that's that's the problem with the 109, really. I mean, I know it does get updated, but the zenith of the 109 is probably the Emil.
It's interesting if you read people like Heinz Knocker and so on. They become critical of the 109 as it goes, especially to the F and the G versions. It's much more powerful, but they become even trickier to handle, and they kill even more novice Luftwaffe pilots because they've only got 50 hours, and then they bin it on landing, and the landing speed is high, and it's a huge number of them lost in accidents.
I find it impossible not to like Heinz Knocker, even though I know he's a Nazi, but just because of his sheer determination to keep getting back in a plane despite being shot down. I think something like 9 times in the course of his
I love him. I think the best bit of I Flew for the Führer is the bit towards the end when he's becoming very disillusioned, and he takes off. It's in a 109, I think, so it will be probably a Gustav, and he intercepts a PR Spitfire at some enormous altitude, and manages to shoot it down or damage it very badly. And the Spitfire's going down, and he's circling it going, "Get out, Tommy, because he doesn't want the bloke to die because he knows it's all futile. Yeah. And it's at that amazing point I thought, if you rewrote this as a commando war story in pictures, he would be the good Nazi, Yeah.
Yes. Although he does go on and pursue a career tried to pursue a career in the 1950s in right-wing politics. But
yes.
I kind of,
we'll ignore that.
We'll ignore that. The bit I like was where he's got Feldwebel Kruger has just arrived, and he's the sort of latest recruit with kind of, 14 hours in his logbook or something ludicrous. I mean, it's obviously not as bad as that. And he says, whatever you do, stick to me like glue, that old adage. And they go off and there are the flying fortresses, and they go and attack it. And he thinks, amazing. Kruger's shot one down and he's on his first pass. How brilliant. Maybe this guy's going to be okay. And literally 5 seconds later, following on the tail of the stricken B-17, which is plunging earthwards, is Feldwebel Kruger, doesn't get out, his Messerschmitt's on fire. And Knocker follows him down and suddenly realizes that Kruger has crashed into the very same field where he went to a recruitment fair by the Luftwaffe on the edge of Hamelin in 1939.
God.
And he then flies over the town of Hamlin, which is his hometown, and there's not a soul to be seen because, of course, there's an air, the planes are overhead, and so they're all in their cellars or whatever. And it's incredibly moving. I mean, really incredibly so. And as I say, it's just impossible not to kind of have a little bit of affection for him, despite him being a Nazi.
Yes. There is room in our hearts for the odd Nazi, obviously.
I think so.
Quite the qualification, Jim.
Well, I met Hugh Herman, who was a proper Nazi.
Yeah.
And I had no affection for him whatsoever. I mean, he was just absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
He was a 190 fan, I have to say. Founded the Wildersau.
They're amazing. They're amazing aircraft, though, aren't they? The 190 is an extraordinary bit of kit, isn't it?
Yes.
Sort of corrects all the possible flaws that the 109 had, I think. It's like taking a long look at what you need to sort out.
Wide undercarriage.
Yeah, all that sort of stuff.
Yes, funnily enough, I was reading a bit about the 190 a few days ago, and it is quite remarkable that, it included a lot of electrical systems. It had rigid controls, so rods rather than cables, and nice big ailerons, because one of the problems with the 109 was it required huge stick forces, but that was coupled with the most cramped cockpit of any World War II fighter, which meant that you had to be incredibly strong, to roll it at speed, because you couldn't get your elbow out to push the stick sideways. They reckon that a typical 109 pilot could exert only something like 40% of the stick pressure in a 109 than he would have been able to if he'd been in a Spitfire or Hurricane.
Wow.
And that was coupled with a higher wing loading.
I've never heard that. That's incredible. So
the 190 got around that by much more powerful controls and a bigger, much better laid out cockpit.
Yeah.
It didn't overdo the wing loading, didn't have those nasty automatic slap things that terrified all the 109 pilots, and also had a wing shape that gave it an absolutely fabulous roll rate, which is what worried the British, which is why the Spitfire 5 was hopelessly outclassed by the early 190Ds and so on. And then they started mucking around with clipping the wings for, roll performance at low levels, so you didn't get aileron reversal and so on, because the Spitfire wing would twist. So it's remarkable. In some ways, I think the 190 was definitely a quantum leap forward in fighter design.
Yeah.
It's funny, though, because they've got one at Cosford, obviously a static one. And you look at it, it's really, really rough around the edges. It's not that kind of sort of precision engineering that that we all know and love from the Nazi era. It's really rough. Panels are kind of on the engine cannon don't quite fit, and it's there's gaps, and it's
very interesting when you look at a lot of those 1930s and 40s aircraft. The 109 in some ways is an exception, because the way the fuselage is mated is quite clever, and in fact it does have a seam on it, which is where people making models of them go wrong, because they fill the seam in on the fuselage of the 109, but it actually should be there for once, because that's how it was made. But 109 apart, if you look at other things, if you stand close to a Spitfire, it's quite disappointing, because when you view it as a whole and you watch it flying, it's this beautiful shape. Every single curve interpenetrates with every other one. There's no corners on it. It almost looks like it was made out of a single piece of putty that was squeezed into shape. But you get up close to it, and it's made of thousands of little itsy bits riveted together and bashed into place. And as I say, it's all wrinkly, and there's gaps and edges and chips and scratches. It just looks like a school metalwork project.
The RF Museum they've got a Focke-Wulf 190 which landed. It's completely intact. It's never been touched since the end of the Second World War, and it's a two-seater.
Yes,
and it's just not been touched. And I remember the talking to Ian Thirk, who was the old curator there, and he's saying, well, if someone wanted to make us an offer, we'd be quite interested in.
No, they mustn't do that. That was the one that flew. I can't remember the pilot's name.
Accidentally flew into sort of Wales or something and landed.
Yes, he flew the reciprocal on his Verge compass, didn't he? Which is very easy to do. But there's also, I don't think they should touch that. There was and I'm not quite sure what happened to this in the end. The Spitfire, there was a Spitfire 1A hanging in the main entrance of the Imperial War Museum that had been put there, I think, or it had been rescued in 1941. So it's a Battle of Britain era aeroplane. Yeah. It was hanging from the ceiling. Squadron. Was it 609?
Yep.
And it's because it's hung on the ceiling for such a long time, it's twisted. And, there was a move at one point, people said, oh, we should restore it to flying condition, but you shouldn't, because you will inevitably replace 80% of it if you do that. And the way it is now, it's actually got 1940 oil stains on it.
Yeah,
and it's an invaluable resource. And you can make a new Spitfire if you really want to fly one. That one, and that FW190, and that very early Emil they've got at the Royal Air Force Museum. Don't touch them, dust them occasionally, but nothing else.
Yeah,
leave them alone.
The thing is restored Spitfires they're basically new aircraft, aren't they?
Even the Johnny Johnson Spitfire is largely new.
Yeah,
it's impossible to do it otherwise, because in order for it to be declared airworthy, the vast majority of the rivets are going to have to be replaced. The spars are going to have to be taken out and replaced. The engine's going to have to be rebuilt. You're going to have to put some modern avionics in it. You've got to take the radioactive stuff off the instrument face. You end up with a new aeroplane.
Yeah, well, they have a similar problem with that with the Mosquito in Lincolnshire. That there's just no way of knowing if that's airworthy at all. So you'd just have to build a new one.
Yeah. And you may as well, if people want to see that shape flying, build a new one, leave the original in the museum.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I completely agree with that one about in the Imperial War Museum, and it's fantastic because it is a bit bashed and the paint's chipped, and as you say, it's got the oil stains and all the rest of it. It was also incredibly emotive because that was flown by one of the pilots of that plane was John Dundas, who was Hugh Cocky Dundas's brother, who shot down Helmut Vick in the Solent and then was promptly shot down in turn. He said, "I've got him," and then that was his last words.
That's the equivalent of saying, "Watch this" before you do a stunt on telly, isn't it? It's always a mistake.
Exactly. So he then went into the drink too, and there he remains. But he flew that plane, and it's it's just amazing to think. I think really.
Yeah, and the ghosts will go if you restore it. It's the same with old buildings and so on.
Absolutely,
just leave them.
And you need some ghosts. Ghosts.
James, to change the subject slightly, how are you getting on with your ambulance? With your K2?
It's not up here. I've taken it down to my garage because I was attempting to paint it with an airbrush.
Oh, really? You're trying that on, are you?
Yeah, but you know what? You've got to learn to thin the paint correctly, and if you get that wrong, it either clogs up or it just comes out as dribble. Yeah, and it's ruinous. When you get it right, it's remarkable. But it destroys part of the fun for me because I have my little Airfix table there, and it takes me just years to make one because I sit at this desk doing my homework, supposedly. Yeah. And occasionally I think, oh, bugger this. And I go over there for 10 minutes and paint one little bit or stick one little bit on. Yeah. And I do it with, little tubes of glue and the little brush glue and paint brushes and the little pots. And that's nice because you can do a bit at a time. If you want to do the airbrush, you have to sort of think, right, airbrush time, clean everything, get everything lined up. And you have to sort of devote an hour.
Sort of need a suite for it, don't you, as well, to extract the fumes and all that sort of stuff.
And the bloody paint goes everywhere.
Because I very much got back into making stuff during the pandemic because, I was suddenly sort of grounded from touring. And I one of my daughters has since moved out. So her room has gone over to being the room that smells of paint.
Oh, really? You've got your own model studio
I've got my own model studio now,
That's very strong.
Did she agree to this? Or
No. It's just happened. And, things like the rowing machine have ended up in that room and all that. It's basically a dumping ground. And I've been dumped in there with my hobby. And sounds
like the perfect life.
Well, it suits me 100%. We're doing a thing with the listeners where we're going to build an entire regiment of Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry Sherman tanks and ancillary vehicles.
And 11 Stuarts.
That's a big job.
It is, because last year, one of the listeners who's a modeler, he 3D printed a whole regiment, but in the little wargaming size. So in whatever scale that is. So we decided that what we should do for next year, for this festival we do in September, is do a regiment in 135th. And we're getting there. There was a lot of argy-bargy about who got to make the Fireflies. Everyone wanted to do sort of glamour tanks. And now it's settled into just lots and lots of Shermans. It's fantastic.
I'm interested in this idea because ever since I was a kid, when I was obsessed with Airfix, and you could only ever afford one at a time back then, obviously. Yeah. And I almost did it on Toy Stories with the Ford Model T kit from Airfix, which is an ancient bit of tooling. But I've wanted to try and productionize it as a production line with everybody with the job, and then tanks or aeroplanes coming off the other end. And I proposed this idea to the BBC. It must have been a few years back because it was at an anniversary.
Yeah.
But it was called, and they really liked it until the last minute when they decided they didn't. And it was called The Battle of Britain in Airfix. And it was a 2-part documentary, the first of which was about how you made all the models.
Yeah.
All of everything relevant to the Battle of Britain is available from the Airfix range. And then the second part, the second hour, which I wanted to be on the next evening, was a deadly serious documentary with historians involved, telling, the truth, the updated, the revised history, story of the Battle of Britain, but the whole thing animated with Airfix models, right down to, balls of cotton wool being lit with lighter fuel to make them blow up. And I would have taken years to do, but I thought it would be such great fun.
Yeah, it would have been fantastic.
Yeah, that would have been amazing.
One of the most enjoyable bits of television I've seen in the last 20 years was the when you recreated Brooklands with the Scalextrics.
Oh God, yeah, that was painful.
But it was actually really quite moving in a funny way.
Was it?
Yes, it was. It really was. I remember feeling quite sort of wistful about the whole thing and what might have been, and on the little bits of bank there still were, and then you had to kind of bridge an A road. I seem to remember.
Yeah, we did all sorts of stupid things.
It was really fun. It was fun and moving and touching.
Well, and
the
one-to-one scale Airfix Spitfire. So similarly, because it was a massive hobby for me when I was a lad, and to see someone acting out the idea that you could and should do this was quite fantastic.
The whole premise of that series, which I did enjoy making, and thank you for watching it, was that when you are a child, so you take anything, Airfix, Lego. When you're a child, you have unbounded imagination, but no real resources, because no parent would understand that you need 50 Spitfires, not just one. When you're an adult, the imagination has fled, but you do have the wherewithal to buy 50 Spitfires. So the basic premise was, we'll put ourselves in the mind of a 12-year-old, but with the clout of a whatever I was then, 45-year-old. So, yes, we will buy 3 million Lego bricks, and we will buy as many Airfix models as we want, because we can.
Yeah, I spent a very balmy evening sitting next to the Lego house in Denby's winery with some friends once.
It was quite nice, wasn't it?
It was very pleasant,
Yeah.
but also sort of quite extraordinary to see. This is partly what we're doing with this regiment project. Is I've built a troop of Shermans because I can buy 5 now or 4 if I want. There's nothing to stop me. And just as you say, I used to have I remember having a little, on a piece of plywood, a little airfield marked out, and you couldn't have, there'd be a Whirlwind and a Spitfire and a Hurricane and a Vought Corsair for some reason all there because you couldn't because that's what they had in the village shop at the time, and you couldn't have like you say 30 Mark V Spitfires. But the thing is if this is oversubscribed, we may end up making the whole brigade.
Well, I'm all for it. 8th Armour Brigade. It would be great to have the whole Sherwood Rangers, but how much better to have the,
Where are you going to put them when they're done?
Well, that's the question. We've not thought further than the festival where it'll be sort of unveiled with a ta-da moment. There's not been a discussion of, do we bring the Imperial War Museum and tell them we've bequeathed them this thing that'll take up tons of space?
Well, maybe the National Army Museum. You can talk to them on Thursday. But it's I think it'll be fantastic to see. And also, we're going to have some vehicles which are done up in Sherwood Rangers colours as well, because we've got a Sherwood Rangers Sherman tank.
Real ones, you mean?
Yeah, and 2 Sherwood Rangers half tracks. So
sounds great. I've often thought but I thought it back in the days of this, which I'm just going to look at for a moment because it makes me feel quite melancholy. But I've never done this, but I always wanted to experiment with the idea of getting, it used to be called isopon when we were kids, but basically acrylic resin in liquid form with a hardener. You used to make a paperweight or something, and you put a dead butterfly in it or something like that. If you made the square mold, could I put this in and turn it into a doorstop or a paperweight? So it would be preserved.
That's a great idea.
Sure, you could.
So it would be preserved forever because it could never be damaged.
Yeah.
So the other thing I thought of was if you make your 100 and whatever it is Shermans and so on, if there was a path through a garden or something where you could make a very neat, very waterproof, say, concrete trench.
Yeah.
and lay all your little tanks in formation in there and then have it sealed over with glass so that people would walk along the tank path and they would be there, for thousands of years, perfectly preserved.
Yeah, that's really brilliant.
That's a brilliant idea.
Because I've got the 1-24 Spitfire Mark V up on my shelf. And the problem is, I did that 15 years ago or whatever. And bits have fallen off, and I've lost.
Of course,
yeah. The glue sort of comes undone. Yeah,
I mean, Al's very kindly gave me a Sherman Firefly done, and it's sat up on my shelf. But it has to be really high because otherwise it's going to get dinged, and the barrel's going to fall off, or some of the stowage or whatever. But putting it in resin, that is genius. I mean, seriously, could one do that?
Well, I don't. Let's not get too nerdy, but I have been researching for a bit. You can buy on eBay and from various other places. It generally comes from sort of art supplies places rather than model shops. But you can buy, I think it's 5 litres of clear acrylic resin with hardener. Now, the things I don't know, I don't think it would attack the plastic.
Well, that was my thought. Is would it react with the plastic or set the glue off or whatever? There's only one way to find out.
Well, exactly. And does it? I think it probably gets.
So
warm.
what would you do? Plonk it in a kind of an old ice cream tub.
Well, I think you'd make a mold. You'd make a simple box mold out of plywood sheets, say.
Yeah.
And you'd have to varnish them or coat them with wax so that it didn't soak in, and then you'd fill it to, say, I don't know, an inch. Put your Spitfire or your ambulance or whatever on. Then you'd have to. You can fill it in stages because the line will disappear. Then you'd fill it a bit more to lock it in place so that it's not going to float away. I've thought about this far too much. And then slowly fill it. But then you want it sitting on something vibrating like the top of your spin dryer so that it shakes the bubbles out, because it would be awful if it worked, but you had a great big air bubble there or there. And I think you'd have to mix the resin so that it had a very slow set time.
Yeah.
Because if you make it set quickly, it gets hot. And if it got hot, it might distort the...
Yeah.
As you say, there's only one way to find out. We'd make a basic Spitfire and roughly paint it and then stick it in and see what happens to it.
Yeah.
What a brilliant idea.
That's a brilliant idea, James. That's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, it's a solution to all your fragile model kit problems.
Yeah, they could live outside. They could be garden ornaments.
Live wherever you like. They could be, as you say, it could be a doorstop. It could be a paperweight. Whatever.
Well, our producer has just popped up and said the answer is yes. I saw it on Facebook recently, as in it works. So someone's done it.
Damn.
That's quite annoying. The other fashion at the moment is for painting the model while it's still on the sprue and finishing it on the sprue.
Oh, and then do that.
And then putting it in a case.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's quite interesting. So it's a deconstructed artwork.
Yeah, exactly. So it's still on so Messerschmitt's still on the sprue, but completely finished. They look rather striking, and then put in a picture frame. They look rather.
I might try that.
And a real reminder of getting the sprue out and what that. That moment
the
when
sprue being the frame on which all the bits are.
Sorry to get technical on you, Jim. Yeah, but
no, that's right, it's fine.
when you first, I mean, it's that thing of, it's like opening the Action Man box and the smell of the hair.
That's properly pervy.
Oh God! Well, about 10 years ago, they did a 50th anniversary re-release, and there was a shop in Carshalton or somewhere that had made thousands of Action Men in China, and they were exactly the same. When you opened the box, it was the same smell of plastic.
They got the smell right. That's good, because smell is a very evocative sense, isn't it? When
I
found that about some old books. They still smell like they smelled when I was 15, and it takes me back immediately.
Yeah. I've got a book that an old desert rat veteran gave me, and he smoked 60 a day, and every time I pick up his book, it still smells of stale fags.
That's quite nice.
And, it's great. I mean, it's a horrible smell, but it just reminds me of Albert.
Brilliant. Well, James, this has been a fantastic chat around the house.
Yeah, it's been great, hasn't it?
Are you going to, when you finish your ambulance, you're going to post pictures of it on Twitter for people to perv on? I'm certainly going to, when mine's done, I'm going to do exactly that.
Yeah, I think I probably will, because, well, I've already put one on of work in progress, so people will be saying to me, have you done the ambulance yet? It's probably going to be about this time next year that it's finished, unless I really put my back into it. Yeah.
Well, it's having a bit of modelling time in the Christmas holes.
Well, I possibly could, but I don't. It's one of those. It's a bit like good books that I read when I was a teen. I don't want it to end. in some ways, because I've become emotionally invested in this pile of annoying plastic bits and little pots of paint.
Yeah, I do put off finishing them, I have to say.
Do you?
I'll start another one and then have them kind of.
I mean, to be honest, I never properly finished this look because I never got the number 000 paintbrush and put the tiny dot of silver in the headlights, which I should have done, and I should have put some, a bit more wash on the radiator grille to make it look used. So, it's still work in progress and has been for 47 years.
Fantastic! What a wonderful thing. Oh, brilliant. Well, thanks very much, James, for talking to us. We hope you have a wonderful Christmas.
Yes, and you. I'm sorry we didn't get on to the Heinkel 177 or the Miles M52, but we can do that on a future date.
We'll have you back.
We'd love you to come back on and we can talk about. I'm very happy to talk about the Heinkel 177 until I'm blue in the face. It's a pet love-hate of mine.
Well, we'll get you back on to talk about that then, James, at some point.
Okay, we've got a date. I'll be sad. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We've been talking to James May. We'll see you all soon. Have a very Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
Bye.